A pleasant good evening to everyone. Welcome to our show. You're listening to Sounds of the Diaspora, artist to artist, a conversation with yours truly, Dion Parson. I do hope you're doing well tonight. We have a special guest tonight that I'm really excited to have on the show. And the reason is because she's someone that's bringing something different to the table. We've been talking about Sounds of the Diaspora. And when we think about the Caribbean diaspora, the African Caribbean diaspora, we think of our cultural music. We think of soca, calypso, reggae. If you're from the French islands, you think of zouk music. If you're from the Spanish-speaking islands like Cuba and Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico, you have bomba, mambo, plena. You have all of those things. And the really interesting thing about all of these musical genres, the multitude of them, all the different musical genres that we play, is that all of the musicians learn to play in school, or they learn to play in church, and they learn from a traditional musical platform. So they learn from classical music. And our guest tonight, and we're really, really excited to welcome to this platform, welcome to Sound of the Diaspora, Dr. Christine Gangeloff.
Hi, Dion. It's great to be here.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us and come and sit and talk with us and bring your view of the sounds of the diaspora, the Caribbean diaspora, to the table.
Well, thank you so much. And first of all, congratulations on this show. It's really, I'm so happy to see it. And it's been so successful so far. And you've had such great guests. And I think it's such an important platform to bring this music to the world. So congrats. And thank you for inviting me. I'm truly honored and humbled to be here.
Well, you're more than welcome, Christine. Ever since I've known you, you've been a wealth of resource, a great friend, someone that has encouraged me in the many things that I've done. And you've invited me to see some of your work with some of your partners firsthand. And I was always impressed by the great things that you're doing. So you were on top of my list when this show came up. I was like, we have to have Christine.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah. So tell us, the Bahamas, how did you end up in the Bahamas?
Okay, so we have a little bit of time here, right? It's a very complicated story. So I'll just kind of give an overview of my background, because I have a very untraditional background. I'm a primary classical musician, but I have as I said, a very non-traditional career path and educational path. So I grew up on a small farm in the Midwest, and not in it like from a musical background at all. But from a really young age, I became completely obsessed with music, and especially the flute. So I started flute in 5th grade, and my parents kind of didn't know what to do with me because I practiced all the time, and they got me a private teacher. And at some point, my father actually called the teacher, and he said, all she does is practice. She practices like 5 hours a day. And what can she do besides play in a bar? And so she had to sort of like talk him down, but they were very supportive. And so I was also a 1st-generation college student. And so I was just kind of finding my way. And I ended up, for my first degree, I went to the University of Minnesota, which was perfect for me because it was close to home. And I had a great teacher at that time. And so I was so excited to study music, like really dive in. And when I got to university, it was great. I loved studying all these topics. But after the first couple semesters, I kind of started to question the education. It was a great education. University of Minnesota, awesome. But there were, for example, in music history, there was some of us who always joked about, all we're learning about is dead white composers. And that really, I always have to say, I do love classical music, but I began to grow uncomfortable with the culture around it and just a lot of aspects around classical music. And so I just kind of started to find ways that I felt more comfortable, that felt more relevant to me and my world. And so I was fortunate enough to have two amazing mentors at the U of M. And those were Susan McClary, is really well-known musicologist. And it was early on in her career. And she was a recipient of the MacArthur Genius Grant. And she's just a brilliant person. I had her from undergrad music history, and she completely kind of changed how I understood music. And at the same time, I stumbled upon, there was an African drum ensemble that had just started at the university, and it was led by master drummer Soa Mensah from Ghana. And I immediately said, I need to join this ensemble. What is this all about? And the thing was, there weren't, I don't think there were any performance students, music performance in the ensemble. It was all mostly master's students studying ethnomusicology. And so I was definitely like not a typical person to join that ensemble, but it really like changed how I saw music between those two. And I remember, and I stayed in that ensemble my entire 4 years of undergrad, and I studied independently with Soa. He taught me some African flute styles, and it really changed so much of how I viewed classical music. And for example, and this fits into the Caribbean diaspora, definitely, because there's a lot of this African aesthetic, but just an example of just some mind-blowing thing that Soa taught me was he said, in Western music, that you think of the intonation of how you tune in an orchestra, like A440 or A442. It's this one sound. Mm-hmm. And the flutes in this ensemble, they were intentionally tuned slightly off, because he said the African aesthetic is a thicker sound. So it's a more kind of robust sound. And you can hear that even in instruments, the extra rattle or the extra buzz in the instruments. Mm-hmm. And so all of that really just opened my eyes, and actually had on my senior recital, I had the African drum ensemble play. I played some of the flute pieces, and I had to sing. And so my advisor was just shaking his head. He didn't know what to make of this. And so I started off this very unique. And then I also made a recital of all female composers, because I said, I don't see any female composers in our curriculum. And I just did all this research and found them. And back then you had to send letters in the mail. And so it was a lot of work, but so that kind of gives you an idea of how I was approaching music. And so I just kept getting music degrees. After that, I went to University of North Texas for a master's. And as you know, that's an amazing jazz school. And right. I was around jazz musicians all the time. And to me, that's, I have the most respect for jazz musicians. And just, I feel like it's one of the most complicated art forms, and the complexity, everything, I just have so much respect for. And so that was a big influence. And they had a Javanese gamelan there. So of course I had to join that. And so, and we've talked about this before, when you're, especially in classical music, it's one of the things I've never been comfortable with is the kind of, it's a little bit elitist. And if you are a classical musician and you do something else, you're kind of looked at with a little bit of skepticism, like, why right. is this flute player studying African drums? Or, it's almost like she must not be able to play the flute or something, like she has to do. So that's been kind of like a lifelong battle for me. So basically wherever I went, I dove in, and to me, I like the African drumming just helped my rhythm so much and gave me this completely different sense of rhythm. And other forms I studied Balinese gamelan when I was at Yale. And again, there I was the only student in the School of Music who participated. And most people didn't even know about it. So that's been kind of my path. So, and then I held different positions, different universities. And again, I was always kind of diving into the local culture. Right. And so when I ended up right before Bahamas, I was in Newfoundland in Atlantic Canada.
Okay.
And so kind of an opposite extreme, but there's actually similarities in the culture, the island culture. And I came to the Bahamas because at Newfoundland at Memorial University, I was on a 1-year contract. And when that contract ended, I started looking for a job, and I really I didn't feel like I was cut out for an American university, like a straight ahead job. And because I had other jobs internationally, and I saw this opening in the Bahamas, and I knew nothing about the Bahamas. And so I applied for it, and I said, let me just see. It was a 2-year contract. And now it's 16 years later, and I'm still here.
Well, I think you found your home. I think you found your home.
Yeah, this is the longest I've ever lived in one place as an adult.
Great. And
Yeah.
the thing is, what you've accomplished in the Bahamas has resonated throughout the Caribbean, because, I've heard your name outside of my own personal circle. I've heard your name with folks just sharing the information that you're disseminating through the Caribbean as you do your research and try to pull everybody together. You're really good at connecting folks, I must say.
Thank you.
That's one of your
I enjoy that.
Yeah.
It's funny because I used to always make fun of people calling networking. And I always thought, what is networking? And to me, it was just making friends and, I really love talking to people and learning about people and their culture and their music. And to me, it's very natural. And so that's why all this research that I've done, it's almost like I don't really think of it as research. It's just kind of what I have to do. And
right.
So it's been a really natural progression from how I approached music in the States and Canada and internationally. When I came to the Caribbean, it was just a natural progression. And of course, right away, I dove in and started learning about the local traditions, Junkanoo, Rake and Scrape. And within a very short amount of time, locals were saying, like, how did you find this? Because I just have a way of just knowing how to dive in. And for example, there's a Junkanoo, there used to be a Junkanoo festival here called Joe Billy. It was kind of a precursor to the main Junkanoo that's on Boxing Day and New Year's. And so Joe Billy is a festival that's what they call over the hill in the Bahamas. So it's in the inner city. And so I started going to that. It was in early December, and so many local people have never heard of it. They say, you go where? It's a dangerous area. And that was like the highlight of the year for me. So yeah, so I just got right into that.
That's great to just immerse yourself in the culture wherever you are. But the thing that I admire about you is that you just don't take it in for yourself. You connect the dots with other folks and you document it and make sure that people know about it. I mean, I grew up hearing about Junkanoo in the Bahamas, but I didn't know as much as I know now, mainly because of you and what you've presented to it, and connecting the dots with the other islands and bringing other folks from other islands to the Bahamas and traveling and sharing that information, because every island has its own vibe, its own musical spin on things. And a lot of times rhythmically, they're playing the same thing, but it's called something different. Junkanoo, Calypso, Mento, Kaiso, it's all the same thing. And it's just like speaking in the South versus speaking in the North. In the South, they may have a twist on the R's, and in the North, they may say it a different way. And that's what I find throughout the Caribbean. But you've done a great job of archiving so many of the cultural components of the Caribbean diaspora, but you've done it from a classical standpoint also. And that's the key here. That's what I wanted our audience to hear, the fact that everything, I shouldn't say everything comes from classical music, but the foundation is the European musicals melodic system, the 12-note scales, stuff like that. And we don't think about that often in the Caribbean, because we're so embedded in our culture, and we play soca and reggae and all of these things, and nobody says, "Oh, I'm going to play me some Beethoven. Let's go and hear that." That's not as popular, but you found a way through your network to connect all of these wonderful folks and composers and create a platform for that style, classical Caribbean, Afro-Caribbean classical music.
Yeah, it's been really just one of the most rewarding projects. And I mean, I can't even call it a project. It's just this ongoing work. But it kind of all started, like I said, I dove into Junkanoo and Rake and Scrape right away. And I'm a classical musician, and I never thought of classical music in the Caribbean. It never occurred to me. And it was just this accidental thing where I was teaching a class on world music, and I wanted to show an example of a Vodun ceremony from Haiti. And there's a large Haitian population in the Bahamas, and I wanted to include that in the course. And so I was Googling to try to find a video, and this probably the Google algorithm knew I was a flutist, and it got this hit, and the video was Voodoo Jazz Sonata.
Okay.
And I stopped and I was like, what is this? And so I opened it, and it's this piece for flute and piano by this Haitian composer, Julio Racine. And I listened to the piece, and I said, this is beautiful and combined so many elements. And I just thought, I was just, this light bulb went off. Like, I never even thought of this. And so then I just kind of started searching for, all kinds of different keywords to see what was out there.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew of some composers in the Bahamas because I had been here and was aware of them. There were a handful, E. Clement Bethel and Cleophas Adderley. And there were, a handful of somewhat documented composers here. And so I thought, well, maybe that's happening on other islands. And I reached out to a former classmate from Yale, Carlos Carrillo, and who you've met. And he's Puerto Rican, but he's teaching at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And I said, I told him I'm kind of trying to document these composers, and I asked him for advice, and he said, go to this conference in Dominican Republic. And it's a conference it's a different topic every year, but it's at Central Leon. And so I went to this conference and just started talking to people. And then I did the same thing. I went to this reggae conference in Kingston, and then I met with the director of Edna Manley College. I think you've met him, Roger Williams.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I met with Roger, and I told him, and by the way, all these people became really close friends, as you know. And Roger was like, no, we don't, there aren't too many composers from Jamaica. But just give you an idea of how I was able to find some of these people. Like my flute repair person in Minnesota, when she found out I lived in Bahamas, she said, oh, I worked on a flute from Jamaica. And I said, oh, can you give me that person's contact information? And so she
networking, there you go.
Exactly. And so she gave me this information, and I got in touch with this woman, and she said, I don't know any composers, but there's this woman, Rosina, and she's married to Peter Ashbourne, who's a prominent Jamaican composer. And so I reached out to Rosina, and she was so excited because she had been documenting Jamaican composers. And I only met her my last day in Kingston, and we met in this parking lot. Like, it was like a 10-minute meeting, and she just gave me this big pile of music and just photocopies of stuff to go through. And then, that led to so many more things. And so it was a lot of like I had to follow all these trails and kind of connect the dots. And I just kept interviewing people. And so some of the other people, Paul Shaw, who's a Jamaican pianist, currently at University of Minnesota. And then I reached out to Marlon Daniel, who's a U.S. conductor. He leads Ensemble de Monde, and he also founded the International Festival of St. George in Guadeloupe. And he's a specialist on the composer Joseph Boulogne, the Chevalier de St. George. Mm-hmm. If you've heard of him, he's he's a contemporary of Mozart from the islands, and which is also kind of mind blowing. But he's definitely come in the forefront in recent years. There's even a Disney movie about him that just came out. Yeah. So he's such an incredible figure. So those are some of the ways that I started to compile the research. But then that's not really my specialty. My specialty is getting out there and talking to people, having these conversations. And so I was talking with a friend at the university who's a research librarian. And so she said, send me this information and I will start to put it in a bibliography. And so we kind of partnered together, and it was a perfect partnership because that's her specialty.
Okay, so you made the connections and sent them to her. And
yes.
So through all of this, that group that you co-founded, Puentes Caribeños, that's how this came about?
That was actually later down the road.
Okay.
So that was a few iterations after the first symposium.
Okay.
So that group, actually all the members of Puentes Caribeños were at the first symposium, because those, so the first symposium was, as I mentioned, Marlon Daniel, when I interviewed him about Joseph Boulogne, and we kind of started scheming, like, we need to get Ensemble de Monde to the Bahamas and play this music of Joseph Boulogne. And because classical music isn't really on the radar, especially of young kids. And I thought, and Ensemble de Monde is this orchestra of very diverse players. And so having children see this orchestra with musicians that look like them and playing music from the Caribbean was just, something. So we had to go through a lot to make that happen. And he commissioned a work from Dominique Lejeune, this really incredible Trinidadian composer who's based in the UK.
Okay.
And so when this all was coming into, like, just forming into this concert, I said, if Dominique is coming here and this orchestra is coming here, we need to, make something else. And so we made this international festival of Afro-Caribbean composers. Okay. And so it consisted of the orchestra, and then some of our local groups, our Seaforth ensemble played. And then I invited some of the people that I had been talking to. So Paul Shaw, Dominique was here already, Peter Ashbourne from Jamaica, Carlos Carrillo from Puerto Rico, and then Adam Walters, who is a composer. He's from the UK, but he's been based at University of Trinidad and Tobago for several years. And he's composed a lot of music influenced by his time there. And so they had a panel of these international composers, and then we did a panel of Bahamian composers. But it's really interesting. It's kind of like what you were saying earlier about all of these styles being the same, but having a different name, or like a slightly different instrumentation to them. Because at this symposium, nobody knew each other. None of those people knew each other before. And they started talking about their work, and everybody kind of kept looking at each other like, that's so similar to what I'm doing. And they would play their music, and they're like, whoa, like this. And it was truly mind blowing. And basically that was kind of the start of it. Like, this has to continue. And we all kind of just became this community.
Right.
And so it evolved from that. And then Adam organized the next symposium in Trinidad at UTT. And then the one that you were at was when we formed Puentes Caribeños. And then we we partnered with the Puerto Rico Conservatory, and we had the next installment there.
Yeah, that was nice. I was totally blown away. I was impressed by, again, the amount of composers and the influences that they all had. And like you said, everybody brought their own style to the table. My good friend Gilchrist Sproul was there as well.
Yeah, I remember.
He couldn't stop talking about it. He's like, man, this is great. This is good, because that's his specialty. He loves to write for orchestras and symphonies and stuff like that. So that's really, really great that happens. And I wish you guys continue success with that project. And I pray for it to continue on, because that's needed. That's a whole nother world of our Afro-Caribbean diaspora that the mainstream, if it wasn't for you, I would not have known about it, to be honest with you. I would not have known about it because you brought that to my attention, and I was totally blown away. So,
well,
great.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, it's my mission. I'd like more people just need to know about it because it's this whole repertoire that people just are unaware of. And so it's just, I'm glad to hear that from you.
Well,
a lot.
Speaking of hearing that from me, let's hear something from you. So you brought along some music, and I know our audience wants to hear some of your music. So we're going to play it first. Tell us what we're going to hear, and then we'll talk about it afterwards.
Okay, so the first track we're going to hear is called Tilla, and it's by Bahamian composer Christian Gangeloff, who's also my colleague at University of The Bahamas. And this is our ensemble C-Force, which we can talk about after we listen to it.
Great. Very nice, very nice. I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed this. Tell us about the instrumentation of that ensemble.
Okay, so C-Force it started initially so it was my second year at the university. Then it was the College of the Bahamas. And we have a very small department. And at the time, we only had 3 full-time music faculty. And it was myself and Christy Lee on piano and Christian Justilian on euphonium. And the 3 of us wanted to play. We all wanted to perform. And Chris Justilian is more of a jazz musician, but he's so versatile. That's one kind of a theme throughout the Caribbean, is this versatility. And Christy's a very much classical pianist. Her background's in opera. And so we said, well, let's form this ensemble. It's this very unusual instrumentation of flute, euphonium, and piano. And so we said, well, we just make it work. And that's also kind of a Caribbean kind of thing of just going with what you have. Like, you just make these ensembles, or you make this instrumentation. It's like cooking. And so at first we started that's from our first CD, Chaka Music. And we started just making our own arrangements because there was nothing written for that instrumentation. I don't know a single piece for that instrumentation. And so it was really interesting. And actually the instrumentation works really well because there's a high voice and then a low voice and then the harmony to fill it in. And so Christy started arranging these opera duos that worked really well. And so on the CD, she arranged these opera duos for our trio. And then I had been doing all this research in the Caribbean composers. And so we made arrangements of some of the pieces I found, because I found some that were folk songs that had been arranged for voice and piano. And so we arranged those for C-Force. And then Chris started composing original pieces for us. And so that was his first piece. So he came to one of our rehearsals and he said, I have something new. And he handed us that music, and Christy really struggled with the rhythm at first because she had never played anything like that. And he had to really work with her, especially on the rhythm. They just drummed on for a while, like practicing the drumming rhythms. But she eventually, she got it so well. But you heard other instruments on that, because so C-Force is those 3 instruments. And we got our name because we're all named Chris. So I'm Christine, and then we have Christian and Christy. And,
nice.
And so, yeah,
triple threat.
Exactly. So we're like, we have to make use of this. So that's how we're C-Force. But we always love collaborating. And so a lot of times we would have students play with us, or when we go, for example, you played with us in Puerto Rico, which was so great. And we did a conference in Dominican Republic, and we got to play with these Cuban musicians. And so a lot of the music is very flexible. It can have other instruments added. And so for the CD, Chris Justilian, as I said, is just this ridiculous musician who can do anything. So he played euphonium, and he also played tuba, that bass line that you heard.
I heard it. Boom, boom.
Yes.
I was grooving on that.
I know that, and that's like a classic Bahamian bass line.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then he also did all the percussion parts on that.
Okay.
So that's all him on that track. And then in other CDs, we had guest percussionists. We had a student playing a couple CDs with us, which was great. So that song he wrote, it's based on the once popular goombay style of the Bahamas. So that's sort of what inspired his composition.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, and I thought that's a great way to kind of start showing people this, because it doesn't sound like classical music. And
yeah, I was taken back because you were soloing on it. He was soloing. I said, okay, this is nice. This is nice. Again, when you think of the Afro-Caribbean diaspora, all of these things fit. And as we talked about earlier before we started the show, that in the Caribbean, you can't pigeonhole yourself into one thing. You have, if you're going to play music, you have to be able to play everything. And that's being versatile. And that really happens in the Caribbean, because what I find is that growing up in the Caribbean, every island have its own vibe. You learn reggae, different aspects of reggae, calypso, soca, mento, junkanoo, all of these different styles that exist here. And then you go to the States, and then you have jazz, and you have, R&B and hip hop, and so we're influenced by all of those styles in the Caribbean as well. Because you turn on your radio station, a popular station, they're playing everything popular from the States. But when you go to the US, a lot of this music is not transferred up there, so you don't hear it.
Right.
So I think we are a bit more versatile being in the region, because we have no choice, because we're
absolutely
so much more. And
yeah.
that's why I think this is important to especially to have you on, to show a lot of the jazz listeners, the jazz audience, how diverse the Caribbean is, because it's not only about jazz or jazz Caribbean or calypso and reggae. It's the foundation. I remember growing up playing John Philip Sousa. I mean, that was, we played Stars and Stripes Forever and Alton Adams and V.I. March. I mean, I didn't even really understand the significance of our own Virgin Islander, Alton Adams, until I was in college and realized how much he contributed to that whole world of traditional marches.
Yeah, absolutely. I even chose a piece by him for my playlist today, just for that very reason.
Okay.
Yeah. But just from what you said, it's so true. And I know Eddie and Charles, who you had on last week, talked about this, and it's so true that there's more of a flexibility in the Caribbean as far as genres and how you can define genres.
Mm-hmm.
And whereas in the US, it's very compartmentalized, and you are a classical musician or you're a jazz musician, and there's very little overlap in a lot of those styles. Mm-hmm. But exactly what you're saying, in the Caribbean, there's this kind of sense of versatility and flexibility. And so in the classical pieces, and it's also kind of like, how do you define classical music? That's also kind of like a lifelong battle that I've had. And there's so many, like what determines if it's classical music. And I don't know, the best way I can think about it is it's basically like concert music or art music, that it's basically like, it's not dance music. It's not intended to be danced to. And it's music that's you sit and listen to and clap when it's over. I guess like that's the best definition.
I've never really heard you at a loss for words. I think you was at a loss for words for that one. That's trying to just describe classical music. It's interesting. Yeah, I never thought about it. Because classical music really exists in the Caribbean, on every island, but it's not really something that's talked about. My wife, Nicole, she's the executive director of the Forum, which is a classical organization, and they do a number of concerts. I think they do like 10 concerts for the season. They bring in string quartets, soloists, a number of different group opera. They present the Metropolitan Opera, and the National Theatre out of London, and it's a great. They have a good following, but nobody talks about it. Nobody talks
Right.
about it. So, but you throw a party and you set up a band in a parking lot, thousands of people are going to come out right away, and it's really interesting what popular music is and how serious it's taken. But I applaud you for what you've been doing and your contribution being in the Caribbean and bringing so much of our Afro-Caribbean music from the diaspora to light, and the musicians that present that as well. So let's hear another one of your songs. What else did you bring for us?
So I chose 4 different tracks that are all very different, and just to show kind of the breadth of this repertoire.
Okay.
And so the next one, this is from our second CD, which is all Bahamian composers. And I can talk a little bit more of that after we listen to it. But the selection from this CD is called Balamena, and it's a traditional Bahamian melody. And this is just like a very lovely arrangement based on an arrangement by E. Clement Bethel, a Bahamian composer. And we did our arrangement of his arrangement. So it's a double. Yeah.
It's very nice. That's very nice. I enjoy that. Reminds me of Harry Belafonte.
Yeah, exactly. It does have that kind of
How's that?
island.
Sun in the sun. Yeah.
Exactly. Totally.
Yep.
Yeah. So I thought that was an interesting selection because through this research, looking at these different kinds of classical composers, the cultural influence comes out in different ways. And so in this particular one is mostly the melody, although you hear that clave rhythm and some of the rhythmic stuff too. And in the first one we heard Tilla, that was mostly the rhythm, the gumbe rhythm. And so composers basically use different, it can be melodic, rhythmic, harmonic in some ways, not so much harmonic, but in the last example, that is something. So I just wanted to kind of show a range of this and how you can't really say there's one particular style. It's not like you can say it's orchestral music or it's this, the instrumentation. That's actually another thing I really love about the music is the flexibility in instrumentation. Mm-hmm. So there's this composer in the UK but his roots are in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I don't know if you've ever encountered him. His name is Roland Sutherland.
No, I haven't.
Okay, so he's kind of my flute hero. He's the most versatile flutist I've ever. He's kind of like the Chris Justilian of the flute, and he plays classical at a very, very high level, and his improvisation in jazz is just incredible. And he specializes in a lot of contemporary music. And he wrote a flute quartet we actually performed together in Malta for this CHOGM, Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And he composed this flute quartet, and it was influenced by his St. Vincent the Grenadines. And the instrumentation could be flute choir, or it could be, flute quartet. It could have added percussion. It could have this section with improvisation, or you could leave that out. And you see a lot of that, that kind of flexibility. And I don't see that in the classical music world otherwise. I mean, maybe in very contemporary music, you have a little bit more of that.
Right.
But so that's another reason that I kind of chose these selections.
It's beautiful. It's wonderful. And that shows us just the versatility of you and your musicians, and how you have to be here in the Caribbean to just create something that beautiful with what you have. And the first time I heard of C4s, I thought about it. I was like, okay, flute, baritone, horn, and piano. Interesting combination, but it's just some beautiful stuff. And I'm really happy that you picked these pieces and sharing them with us. So that's good. One of the things I know that you guys, your group has done, you published some manuscript that goes along with the CD. And can you talk to us about that a little bit? Tour de Force. Can you share that with us?
Yes. Yeah. So Tour de Force is our third CD, and that is a double CD of all Caribbean composers. And
classical composers, correct?
Yes, classical. Mm-hmm. But again, some of it sounds like, the first song you heard, I think a lot of people wouldn't to say that doesn't really sound classical, but in our definition, or to use Garrett McQueen, he's another one of my conspirators, I guess. He calls it so-called classical. So that's been my favorite term so far. So I guess we have all so-called classical music. And what happened with that CD, we recorded the double CD, released it, everything. And that same collaborator I mentioned earlier, Kathleen Legrand, the research librarian, she and I we've been working on these bibliographies documenting this music. And so we had the idea to use the CD as a foundation of a book. And so basically we put together this book that featuring the composers in the CD and the soundtrack of the CD. And it would talk about each composer, but then we also went to the popular music and the folk and traditional religious music that influenced those composers. So the soundscape that they heard growing up. So we would give explanations about those different styles and how those composers were influenced in their writing. I think Dion froze or I froze.
Hello, Christine. Dion is frozen. Do you want me to move on and play your next song for you?
Yeah, actually, do you want me to, why don't you play it and then I'll talk about it afterwards?
Wonderful. Dion should be back on by then.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
That was very nice. That was really, really nice. And thank you for playing that piece that featured the flute and actually the piccolo, right?
Piccolo, yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yes. Yeah, I'm glad you like it. I chose that just for you because that's Alton Adams, who you mentioned earlier.
That's his piece. Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
So, yeah, and I think he's such a historic figure. And again, I had never heard of him. I know you grew up playing his marches, but I don't think they left. I mean, maybe Virgin Islands' Own was played in the States, but not.
Yeah.
I had never heard of him. So I discovered that piece through one of these like I think Calvin Jones, who you know, sent me a recording of the U.S. Navy Band playing in St. Thomas.
He wrote for the Navy Band. That was
exactly right.
Yeah.
And speaking of versatile musicians, of course, and so I got this score from Calvin, and I interviewed Alton Adams Jr. many times. He was very supportive of the work that I was doing, and he gave us permission to make a piano reduction of the band part.
Okay.
And so that's basically how we have that piano part. So that's what we recorded. But I've played that piece a couple times. I actually played it on St. Thomas with Bertha C. Bisholte Middle School Band, which was so much fun. I mean, those kids did so great. And it was so fun to be able to play that on St. Thomas. And then I played it with Christy at Alton Adams Historic Home, which is now it's a, who owns that property now?
Some big company.
Yeah, exactly. So it's this big company, and they had a celebration, and they wanted that piece played.
Right. Yeah.
And so I played it there, and then I also played it with the Royal Bahamas Police Force Band.
Okay.
And so I've gotten some good mileage out of that piece.
It's a beautiful piece. It's a beautiful, and the thing is, I'm one of the reasons why I'm happy you played it, not only to honor Mr. Adams, but the flute and the piccolo is one of those instruments that you rarely, especially the piccolo, you rarely hear it outside of the concert hall.
True.
But in Caribbean music, it's one of the prominent instruments. I know in the Virgin Islands, we have our cultural music is called Quail Bay. And the flute is one of the prominent instruments. There's a group on St. Croix, Stanley and the 10 Sleepless Nights, and Stanley, the leader of the group, is a flautist. And
I know.
every song he does this thing on it, and it's a sound that we're so used to hearing in the Caribbean. I know in Cuba, Cachao, the great bass player, he used a lot of clarinet and flute, especially in his music. And even the artists that came out of the Bronx, Tito Puente and all those guys, they use a lot of that. So that's a sound that's really prominent in the Afro-Caribbean diaspora. So I really appreciate it. Why do you think that is?
I think it's probably military, but like a lot of these instruments came from the military.
Right.
And although that's mostly brass instruments, but the flute and the fife and drum is common on a lot of these islands too. So to me, that's, more of a military influence, because Saint Kitts and Nevis also has the fife and the big drum tradition. So that's another, but you're right. In Cuba, the flute and piccolo is very common, and they play so high. All of their music, they love that top register. Yeah.
Well, it goes back to saying, now that you mentioned the military and the fife of drums, is going back to saying to reflect what you mentioned earlier about using what you have. So if that's prominent, because a lot of the islands were British, they were colonized by the British, so that aspect of the military and the regiments and the music was part of that. So I think the musicians that learned that platform transitioned into the popular music and the dance music and played those instruments. Definitely.
Yeah.
That's
super
great.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's great. Man, some wonderful music. I really, really appreciate that. I really appreciate it. That was a good hidden gem.
Thank you.
No, thank you for bringing that to all.
No, I love that piece. I mean, part of all this research I'm doing is also for selfish reasons, because I get to play all this great music.
It's a catch-22. It's like you get the best of both worlds.
Exactly.
Great. I know we're winding it down, but we're not quite finished yet. Couple other things here. So in the Bahamas, you're very engaged in the community, and you're doing some wonderful things, and you're the artistic director of the Nassau Music Society. Tell us a little bit about that. What's going on with that?
Yeah, so I've been doing that for about 5 years. When I first came here, they've been in existence for 55 years, actually. Okay. And so they were still in existence when I got here, and I was on the committee at that time, and I was kind of in the background because I was still learning the ropes of the music community. And it was sometime I told you about the Marlon Daniel and the Ensemble du Monde. So that was with the Nassau Music Society. Okay. Although I was not artistic director at that time. That was sort of a kind of takeover on my part. I just had this idea that I just had to make happen. And so in the last 5 years, I've been more involved as artistic director. And it's been really great because it's been another way that I can bring these musicians together. And I've really made a point to feature a lot of local musicians from the Caribbean and the Caribbean diaspora. So I've had Liam Teague, the steel pan player from Trinidad. He's actually coming again this year. He was here a couple of years ago, and that was a huge hit, and people loved it. It's interesting. Steel pan is not a big prominent instrument in the Bahamas. It is in almost everywhere in the Caribbean, but it was in the Bahamas years back. But it was still embraced. And Roland Sutherland, that flutist that I mentioned, he was able to perform here a few years ago. This Trinidadian soprano, Nicole Jordan, came and did incredible concerts. And then also I get ideas from your wife too. So she she had Warp Trio, and I wasn't familiar with their work, and I love their stuff. Yeah. And they're exactly like what we're talking about, like their sense of flexibility and kind of genre bending. Like they do all hip hop,
they really bend, but it's great. And again, talking about a Caribbean influence, I forgot the piano player's name, Michelle.
Yes, he's Trinidadian.
Yes. So he's bringing all of that to the table. This is really amazing musician, and everybody in that group. And I love the openness. They embrace everything, and they incorporate it. They could put the kitchen pot in there, they will.
I mean,
and it's so good.
Yeah, they're amazing. Like I came up with so much stuff for them to do while they were here, because we'll just work the whole time. And so the favorite thing I've done with Nassau Music Society was with Warp Trio, and I put them on a jitney, these little buses that we have going through like the tourist area, and so they went on a jitney, and I knew the jitney driver, and he was super excited to make this happen. We picked him up on Cable Beach, this tourist area, and drove in a functioning bus downtown. And tourists were getting on the bus, and there was this band playing in the bus. and they were totally game for it. Like they loved it. And it was so great. And then they played a little concert downtown. And it was just kind of a way to, because our concerts are, slightly more formal. And this was just a way to get them out there and a little bit more exposure to the group. So it's been fun.
That's great. I'm smiling because I did a State Department tour in I think it was like 2019 with Wycliffe Gordon to Sri Lanka. And you're talking about putting them on a jitney. They put us on these tuk-tuk, these little carts. So like right. One instrumentalist, it was like 5 of us in a row, and it was like I didn't even have a regular drum set. They hooked up this electronic drum set to go through a sound system, and Wycliffe is on one, and we went through the town area, and this tuk-tuk playing, when the Saints go marching in, and had this whole embassy barricade behind us. It was amazing. It's quite interesting, like how creative you'll be to get that music out there. So I'm smiling as you're talking about putting them on this jitney, and I'm like, yeah, I did that.
That is funny.
I did that. That was quite a show. We had so
no
much
kidding.
fun with it. Yeah,
I know. Not many musicians could say that.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you gotta be unconventional, to bring the music to the people, because everything we did while we were in Sri Lanka was at the embassy for all these
Mhm.
dignitaries, and the ambassador was like, man, how can we get to the people? And they weren't sure if they organized a community concert, if it was going to be embraced. So it was like, let's just drive through the neighborhoods, and that's what we did.
Oh, I
So
love that. That's
you,
brilliant.
you have to have fun. You have to have fun. So it's great. But
Yeah.
you've brought so much to the table for your time, 15 years, 16 years being in the Bahamas. And I really wish you continued success in everything that you're doing. And I'm here for any reason you need to call upon me, and just let me know, because I think what you're doing is important, and the classical component is really important for all instrumentalists, because we come up with that fundamentals. And I really applaud you for what you've contributed to the entire Caribbean, not only the Bahamas, since you've been here. So continue the success. You're part of the diaspora, so we're gonna be, checking in with you to see what great things you have going on, and keep us posted, because anywhere we can help and spread the word, keep us posted. I think you have one more song, right?
I do, if we have time for it.
We do have time for it. So I just kind of want to get that song going, and then I'll let you wind us down.
Okay, perfect.
Very nice. Very nice. What was the title of that song?
So that was the final movement of the Sonata Voodoo Jazz by the Haitian composer Julio Racine that I mentioned earlier.
Okay.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, he was a great influence on me, a friend and mentor. And so that piece I thought was a perfect one for the diaspora because as he describes it, it's the piano is a 90% drum. It's just like drumming. You could hear that playing that Haitian rhythm. And so it has the Haitian, the voodoo rhythm in the rhythm aspect of the piece. And then the harmony is where the jazz comes in. So you could hear all those nice jazz harmonies. And the form and the instrumentation are what make it the sonata. So it's the classical element. So it's really kind of a merging of three styles of music.
It's really nice. And I had a think. That's the rhythm, yeah. Really
Yeah,
nice. Yeah,
exactly.
And this is a song that you research when you're teaching the history class, the world history class, that kind of started this whole process.
Exactly. This is the one that the YouTube or Google algorithm led me to. Yes.
Nice. Well, it's a good representation of what you're doing, the work that you're doing with C-Force, with your colleagues there in the Bahamas. Continued success, like I mentioned earlier. It's been so great having you on the show and just talking with you. It feels like, we could do this every week. So
I know. Well, thank you so much. This is, like I said, this is such an honor, and I'm so happy that you're doing this work. And same thing, I really admire everything that you're doing. So happy to see it. I try to tune in every week.
Oh, appreciate that. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we're expanding our distribution horizon. So any last words, any comments you want to give to our audience worldwide?
Yeah, support local music and just be open-minded. And there's, again, like, this is music that is so not known around the world, and people hear it and they're just blown away. And same thing with all the work that you're doing in jazz. I came upon that simultaneously with the classical music, all these jazz musicians that are, showing their cultural roots in their music. And I just feel like that needs more of a worldwide platform. So check it out, people. Tune into Dion's show every week.
Thank you. And we'll be talking more about Jazz Caribbean as we progress and develop that style and bring more elements to the table. So thank you for being a wonderful guest, sharing your knowledge and information with us, Dr. Christine Gangeloff. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Please join us next week as we bring a wonderful, talented, dear friend of mine, musician to our platform, Sounds of the Diaspora, Artist to Artist, conversation with Dion Parson, the one and only Samuel Blazer from Switzerland. And he will be talking about his upcoming project, Roots, which is a tribute to the one and only Don Drummond, the trombonist that helped to create the Scatterlights. Samuel just created a new band, a new project, Roots, that's featuring the music of Don Drummond and other musicians from Jamaica. And the CD was just Grammy nominated. So we're very excited to have him on the show next week. And he is going to talk about the whole process of putting Roots together and the other projects that he's working on. So thank you all for being a wonderful audience. Thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to join us. And we really appreciate you spending your time with us. Until next week, take care. All the best.